Good morning and good evening, everyone. Welcome in Salesforce Apex R. And today we are going to talk about Sandbox strategy for enterprise implementation. And today's speaker is Guha and Aditya. My name is Amit Chaudhary, and I'm the founder of the Salesforce Apex Hour. And I'm not going to take your lots of time. And let me hand over to our speaker, Guha and Aditya.
So, hello everyone. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, depending on your time zones. Um, let's get started. So, today we are going to talk about sandbox strategies. If you are in Dreamforce, it's going to be a probably it's going to be a refresher if you are in my session. If you haven't been to Dreamforce or if you missed my session in the Dreamforce, probably it's a good topic to listen in. We are bringing back our Dreamforce session into Amit's channel. And thanks, Amit, for giving us that opportunity. It's a great work that you're doing with your Apex Hour channel, and it's a great resource for all the technical topics. So to get started, so I am Guha Arumugham. I am from Washington, D.C. So I'm working with Acumen Solutions as Senior Technical Consultant. So I've been in this ecosystem for 9 years now, 9x certified. And it says Dream in Speaker here because I was presenting in the Dreamforce for the first time this year. So now I'm a Dreamforce speaker as well. And then also I manage the McLean community here, and also the Salesforce Saturdays in DC and Northern Virginia. And how about you, Aditya?
Thank you, Amit. Thank you, Guha. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, depending upon your time zone. My name is Aditya Pothukuchi, working as lead engineer at GrabHub. I'm in 11 plus years of experience in Salesforce ecosystem with a 15x certified, and I'm going to May 16th next month. I run a Sandbox user group in Illinois, which is suburbs of Chicago, and also I'm a lightning champion. And I can add, like, I'm a Dreamforce speaker going forward. So if you missed our Dreamforce session, so thanks to Amit for giving this opportunity to spread this entire topic to the other, all other people who could not able to make it. So this is a nice topic. All right. So you all know this forward-looking statement, right? So self-explanatory, but still we will explain. So before we get started, please note that Salesforce is a public traded company. So please make all your purchase decisions based on the current features and functionality. So that's what it is about. And today's agenda is we don't want to explain more details on like what we are going to explain and all, but initially, like we love to start from the basics, right? So Guha will explain about like what is sandboxes and how many types of sandboxes and quota allocation of sandbox and all. Then life cycle of a development, life cycle of development, and how many type of sandbox use cases are there, and what is the strategy that we are going to propose with our experience, and what are the best practices, some of the best practices that we just want to cover. So Guha, why don't you start with basics? So explain us about what is sandbox and when we use and what is the purpose of sandbox.
Sure. So for sandboxes, so many of you would have been wondering what is actually why they named it as sandbox, right? So in the real world, if you look at the meaning of sandbox, it's basically it's a safe environment for kids on the beach to play around. So as you see in this diagram, assume your kid is the astro, and it's a boxed environment on the sand on the beach for your kids to build a castle or play safely inside that box, so it does, your kid doesn't go around and get missing in the beach or into the water. So that's why they call it a sandbox in the practical world. And Salesforce is offering, as a CRM platform, it is offering another safe environment for you to do your development, testing, and training. It's kind of a similar safe environment for you that is isolated from production, and so you can go ahead and play around and mess it up with mess it with it, and then you can do your development, you can do your testing, you can do your training. So it's like Sometimes it is a copy of complete production. Sometimes it is a separate environment from the production, but it is connected to your production. So whatever you do in your sandbox, it stays inside the sandbox, and it doesn't affect your real-time application or real-time platform that you are leasing from the Salesforce. So that's what sandbox means. So you can do your development, testing, and training over there. And then Salesforce offers you different types of sandboxes. So let's see what are the types of sandboxes. And from this presentation, you might be wondering, there is no mention of the new sandbox that was out in the Dreamforce. Yeah, we still don't have much details about it. They had just announced it. So we will be just talking about it at the end of the presentation, but we will keep updating based on how it's going to be circulated in our ecosystem. So let's wait for more updates from Salesforce on that. So to start with the existing types of sandboxes, so we have developer, developer pro, partial copy, and full copy. So to start with developer, developer pro, pretty much it explains itself, right? So you do your development there. So it is specifically meant for development activities. So with the developer, you get 200 MB of space, which basically is a very small space, considering in today's world. But it's a good space for your development activities. So you can mock up your own data. You can create your own test records, probably 10 records per object if you're using multiple objects. And you can do your unit testing there. And yeah, you may not be doing a realistic data testing over in the developer sandbox, and it is not advisable as well. So that's why they have given us 200 MB, and you have 1 day of refresh cycle. And for developer pro as well, you have 1 day of refresh cycle. So which means if you're messing up with your developer environment, you can pretty much refresh it from your source sandbox quickly for every day, just in case if you messed up something and you couldn't recover it from whatever you did. So you don't have to worry about waiting for days to refresh that sandbox. You can quickly refresh that sandbox. And the only difference between developer and developer pro is pretty much for bigger sandbox, which means it gives you 1 GB of data, and it doesn't give you the data. It gives you 1 GB of storage, so you can load 1 GB of data in that. So which means you can get some production data and then just mark it up and load it into your developer pro sandbox. So you can also test the data. So which basically comes to your point of testing, right? So you can have your internal team, your internal QA team to test your data, and then you can ask them to like approve of your application or approve your module that you're developing, or your development team's module. So that is why it is called developer pro. It's a 1 step above the developer. And moving on, we have partial copy and full copy. So partial copy, which basically means you have partial copy of your production data. So which will not guarantee you all the production data. If your production data is going to be like millions of record, probably you can get like half of the record with a stipulation of 5 GB of storage limit. So if your million records is going to be taking like 15 GB, you will not even get that half a million of record there, because your storage limit is only 5 GB. So whatever you can accommodate within that 5 GB, you can bring in all those production data. So that is why it's called partial copy. And the main purpose of this sandbox would be for internal training or very high level testing, which means your integration team, or maybe your other the high level UAT team of testers can also use the sandbox for testing. And if you see the refresh cycle, it is like 5 days per refresh cycle. So which means it gives you some time for you to test it. And then if you want to decide, if you're going to decide that this sandbox is messed up and you have to refresh, you still have like 5 days of time for you to like really look into the data and see if it is really messed up, or if you look into your development and see if it is really messed up. So moving on to the full copy, you might find it curious there is no limit on the size. That is because your full copy is basically a mirror copy of your production. So which basically means that if you have 1 million of records, you get the whole 1 million of records. And this is basically for the purpose of Either you stage your development. So for example, you are developing an application which is going to go live for the next year. So you complete the application by December, and let's say your go live is on only June of next year. So you're gonna go and stage all your application in one of the sandboxes, and this would be the ideal sandbox that you can choose. And if you see the refresh cycle, it is 29 days. So which basically gives you 1 month of time for you to, understand the whole application. And this sandbox is uh, meant for the stakeholders, or maybe a specific group of people who might be wanting to test the whole application as a real-time user. So it's basically like a production, but the users can actually, the close group of users actually can have a flavor of how this application will react in the production. So that's what this full copy sandbox means. And so before moving on, so Adi, why don't you talk about some of the key features of the sandboxes?
Sure. There are many, we all know, like there are many features that Sandbox are giving us before moving all your changes to production, but we want to cover like two key features, which is one of them is like Sandbox templates. So most of the people we have already used, but we know that. So Sandbox template is like, if you want to create rather than just a refreshing a sandbox or just creating a sandbox with the exact copy of with the same object, same data and same metadata components. So start using of Sandbox template, so that as Guha already covered, each sandbox has like how much allocation and all. So based on that, you can decide, okay, in this sandbox, I want to test only a specific functionality with integration of another system, or specific functionality you want to cover with a large amount of data. Then only those type of objects, that metadata only you can have on your sandbox, whatever that you're going to create. How you can able to do that? Using Sandbox templates. So Sandbox templates give you a flexibility that you can choose what object and what data, and whether you want to copy like a full copy sandbox on partial copy sandbox. You can have the flexibility where you can have these on Sandbox templates. That is one of the very nice feature. So rather than completely creation everything and losing your data, your storage allocation, just use Sandbox templates. And next feature is Sandbox cloning. So all metadata can be copied onto your new sandbox. And if you want to create a same license type, use Sandbox cloning. And whenever you're refreshing a clone sandbox, if from its source, it always refers to the source of the sandbox, whatever it is cloned from. Example, say you cloned a full copy sandbox from a full copy sandbox, and the sandbox whatever you created newly you want to refresh, it always refers to the sandbox from which it was cloned, not from your production instance of Salesforce. That is the only thing that you have to keep in your mind when you're using a Sandbox cloning. So these are the two key features. And coming to the Sandbox allocation, if you ask, like as Guha already covered all allocation limit and refresh time intervals and everything. So if we talk about Sandbox allocations, so these are the allocations Salesforce is giving us. So if your production instance is using like professional edition of Salesforce, then you will get like a 10 developer sandboxes. And if you're using enterprise, 25 developer and one partial copy. If your production instance using a performance edition of Salesforce, then you'll get all different varieties of sandboxes, 100, 5, 1, 1. These are the numbers. And unlimited edition of Salesforce if you're using, and you will get the same exactly whatever the number of sandboxes that you get for performance edition, same number of sandboxes you will get. So if you, the only thing is if you want, Salesforce is giving us a one full copy sandbox. If you want like a one more full copy sandbox, it's you have to buy from Salesforce, and I think it's 23% or 30% of your actual contract with Salesforce. It's not cheap, it's very costly. Keep that in mind. Coming to anyone can ask like why those stars we provided on performance edition, right? So performance edition sandbox earlier Salesforce used to provide, but now recently they deprecated that. Deprecated in sense they're not giving that type of edition of Salesforce if you request them. But if your production instance, or if your organization is already bought a performance edition of Salesforce, then you will be continuing with the same version. They don't want to move from one edition to another edition. If you already have a performance edition of Salesforce, you will continue using that. But if you're just now entering into Salesforce ecosystem and you want to buy a performance edition, you won't get that because Salesforce is not offering that edition of Salesforce. So that's why we just mentioned that stars on that one. And as as of now, we covered sandboxes, sandbox allocations, and what is the refresh interval and what are the key features and all that. So Guha, why can't you jump into the typical development lifecycle? Because as of today, everyone are using the agile methodology, right? So why can't you explain us about the agile development lifecycle, what exactly it is?
Sure. So yeah, so Agile development lifecycle is also a great resource we need to look into before we even start looking into the sandbox strategies as such. So so we'll give a recap on that. So we, as you see in this whole diagram here, so it all starts with an idea. So idea is basically your business requirements. It could be your user requirements, depending on the type of the business you are. Sometimes it could be just the survey from your user feedback, and so on. And so those get converted into your user stories in your agile world. So which basically means user stories are the small blocks of items that you would be developing in the future as a software, right? So you accumulate the user stories and put it in a backlog. So we call it as backlog. And once this backlog is ready for grooming, so you groom the backlog and assign it to your development team. So which becomes the delivery team in any of your teams. And then you have developers, coders, and configurators. You have QA people who will be testing it, and you have data migration specialists who would be doing on the data side. So everything happens in a cyclic process. So developers will code and develop it, and configurators will be configuring all those process builders and lightning flows, and the QA people will be keep testing that as and when your each user story is done. So this is going to be a cyclic process, and we call it a sprint. So once this process is done, your QA team is going to send it to your other orgs, which is going to be some other sandboxes. So that's where your user acceptance testing will happen. So user UAT is basically a group of people chosen to do some level of testing as a user. So not as a coder, not as a developer, not as a configurator. So you'll be testing as a user. So which means like you will be part of either the real-time user, or you'll be set of people who will be just assuming as a user and end user perspective. And once the user acceptance testing is done, this either it goes back to the backlog depending on the bug or the defect present in it, or it goes directly to the next levels, which is it could be either production or it could be other sandboxes depending on the size of the organization. So this whole cycle is called the development process. And then once it goes, so the process of migrating from the UAT environment to the production, we call it as release management. So once that process is happening, as we always tell, no software is bug-free in the world. So which is very obvious. We as end users, when we use application, we find few things and then we report back to the whoever the provider is, right? So the users are going to send back few either the feedback, or it could be a critical bug that needs to be fixed. So we call it as break fix, and then it either gets pushed to the backlog or it gets to the development team directly, because you may not have much time to respond. So you may have to fix the bugs in few hours. So sometimes it directly goes to the sprint cycle. So you simultaneously work on the bug fixes as well. So this is a very high level snapshot of agile development lifecycle. The reason we are explaining this is because you need to understand this whole cycle to start doing the strategizing work for sandboxes. So when we talk about this, we also need to look at some of the use cases where you would be using certain sandboxes, where you should not be using certain sandboxes. So if you see here, this is a chart of like I would call it as a cheat sheet for the use cases in the sandboxes. So on the left-hand side, you would see a multiple set of use cases, and on the right-hand side, we have 4 types of sandboxes that we are using today. So let's go one by one. So if you see the build, proof of concept, QA, so these 3 are the activities, the common on the ground activities that happens in every project, right? So your delivery team starts building it. Some of your tech leads might be doing your proof of concepts and to make sure that it is feasible in Salesforce. And your QA team would be obviously testing it, whatever you're building. It could be either configuration, it could be either development. So we would strongly suggest go with developer sandbox or developer pro sandboxes for that, and never ever use your partial copy or full copy for those things, because that's a very highly specific environments for your either your testing on a very high level or your staging process. And you might see the QA slightly overlaps on the partial copy, because sometimes if it is a smaller team, your QA would be the UAT users as well. So when it comes to QA, they might also play the role of UAT. That's why we have overlap of on the partial copy sandbox, because they can also use the partial copy sandboxes. And coming back to the other different levels of testing, integration testing, batch data testing. So integration testing is basically, it could be either the third-party system integration testing, or it could be the integration testing of 2 different sandboxes. Like your team 1 develops something in sandbox 1 and your team 2 develops something in sandbox 2. So team 1 doesn't know what happens in team 2, and team 2 doesn't know what happens in team 1. So you need to push everything into one sandbox and then give them for testing. Like, so that's called integrating these 2 modules that they have worked on Salesforce, and you have to test those 2 modules so that you make sure that these 2 modules work cohesively with each other without breaking each other's functionality. So you can pretty much use so actually there is a mistake in this particular row. So you may not be using full copy for that. You can pretty much use these 3. Sorry about that. I think there's some typo here. So forget that full copy for that row. So I would not suggest using full copy for that, and use developer pro, developer, use partial copy based on the team sizes. And batch testing, yes, obviously you go with a lot of data. So which means like you might have like millions of data and you want to do like a heavy load testing or batch processing of the nightly process. So those can be done on the partial copy, because that has a huge data capacity, as we already told. So you can go with partial copy or full copy on that. And for training purposes, yes, obviously you go for partial copy and full copy, because that's going to be a real-time users who will be getting trained on your application, right? So you may want to choose the partial and full copy. And user acceptance testing as well, because you have the partial data there in partial copy, and full copy, you have the full set of data. So it will be the ideal environment for your user acceptance testing. And performance load testing and staging, if you see, it's only dedicated for full copy. Yeah, never ever do in your developer or any other sandboxes, because performance and load testing is very specific for how your application is performing under a heavy load of data, or maybe your realistic data that is coming from production. So you definitely need the full list of data that you have in the production. So the only sandbox that will be applicable for performance testing would be full. It is not a hard written rule that you cannot use for other sandboxes. It's all these use cases are all a recommendation that you can consider using these sandboxes. But if you have a hard limit on full copy, if you do not have the leverage of taking advantage of the full copy, then you can consider using the partial copy. And same with staging. Yeah, stage the application only in the full copy, no partial copy or any other. Obviously, no developer or developer pro. If you are running out of full copy, and if you, let's say you have a limitation on full copy, you cannot do a staging there, then you can consider doing partial copy with some known limitations there. So that's all the very high level use cases. And so moving on from here, so we can see the deployment flow. So if you look at the 2 slides here. So the list of use cases, it is also arranged in a way that it it represents your whole deployment lifecycle. So if we go to the deployment lifecycle here, so it's basically a flow. It's not a lifecycle. So you start with the development and QA in your lower sandboxes, which basically means your developer or developer pro sandboxes, depending on your team sizes. And we have a source control there, which basically is a GitHub or GitLabs or maybe Bitbucket, whatever you want to choose on your comfort level. And you do everything there, push it to your source control, do your merging, do your conflict resolution, whatever you want to do on that, and keep your source control clean so that you can now move your sources from the source control to your other sandboxes. And you can also do this without the source control if your let's say your sandboxes are having only configurations. Let's say your project doesn't involve any development, then you can consider removing that source control. You don't have to have it a hard limit. Sometimes organizations don't permit source control due to various restrictions. Might be a very controlled environment. They wouldn't be approving any third-party tools other than say Salesforce. So in that case, you might not be even be able to use source controls. So that at that point, you can directly do it from sandbox to sandbox in the same flow. And if you see on the integration testing, that's where, as I told, different teams merge their modules into one sandbox and then test it. So you can go with Developer Pro or you can go with partial copy depending on the size. And specifically, partial copy is for the third-party integrations as well. Like if you have multiple systems, you can do your integration testing there. Apart from Salesforce, if you're testing some other web integrations, you can do it there. That will be an ideal environment. That's why we kept two other options as well. And user acceptance testing, as we already told, like it's only dedicated for partial copy because you will have the partial data and also you'll have all the applications in place, so you can actually do a user level of user perspective of testing. And then you go for the full copy after the user acceptance testing is done. So that's what we call it as staging. And from staging, you go to production. So it's a very typical deployment flow. And as we always tell, do not assume this is a 1D deployment flow in the industry. It is basically an ideal deployment flow. So you can always expand this deployment flow based on your organization structure or the level of sandboxes it is involved in your organization. So with all this and the understanding, so Aditya, why don't you talk about some of the implementation sizes that we will ideally find in the Salesforce implementations?
Sure. So we all come across like different organization, and every organization will have different sizes of teams, right? So like Guha mentioned, don't consider this is like exact number that we come up, but based on our experience, we just segregated implementation sizes like 3 different ways, like small, large, and enterprise. So we all know like small teams as if a team size of like 1 to 10, which consists of like 2 admins and 8 developers, or 3 admins and 7 developers, whatever the number that you want to take. So if the team size is like 1 to 10 and the project duration is like 1 week to 6 weeks, then you just consider that as like a small implementation. So larger implementation like 10 to 100 team, 100 members will be there in that, and implementation size is like 3 to 6 months, then you can consider that as large. So enterprise, so the name itself is saying like a combination of small and large, like team size of like 100 plus, and the implementation duration is like 6 to 18 months, then you can consider that implementation as like enterprise. So in these three, like small, large, and enterprise, you can consider like the implementation will be like a multi-cloud or a single cloud, like a sales cloud implementation or service cloud implementation. You can consider like that. But definitely at an enterprise level, as a big number of people are involved in that entire implementation, and definitely it will be a multi-cloud. So we are not saying like it has to be a multi-cloud, but most of the cases in our experience, we see it will be a multi-cloud. But entire team is working for the same production deployment, and maybe the organization is using like multiple clouds, like marketing cloud, service cloud, and sales cloud. Maybe one team dedicatedly working on sales cloud for new development, and another team is working on Service Cloud for enhancements request, and Marketing Cloud also working on the new implementation plus enhancements. So there are multiple clouds involved and multiple teams involved, and the project duration will be like multiple months, not like weeks. They can implement and they can push that. So these are the typical 3 different varieties of implementation we come across, and the duration. Uh, these are the implementation sizes that you can consider. And
So,
yeah,
so Adi, so we have seen this implementation sizes, right? So,
correct.
so as we know, today's topic is about the strategies.
Yeah,
So what do you mean by strategy? Like, how do I
yeah,
see a strategy as a layman person? Like, if I haven't heard about the word strategy, what actually strategy means?
correct. So as of now, we covered different varieties of sandboxes, different implementations, development life cycles, and the implementation sizes. All this, like how these are all related to the strategy of sandboxes, right? So you consider the strategy, whatever that we are proposing here, as like a Legos. Say you bought Legos for your kid, and you just bought and you just throwed all the Legos on the floor. Will that make any sense? No. You bought Legos to construct something, right? So once you start constructing, like whatever is there in your mind, you want to start with that, and you will be implementing that one, right? End of your implementation, you will achieve something. Okay, whatever that I want to create with these Legos, okay, I created that, right? So where in that process you followed some strategy, that okay, you want to create something, and you used Legos and you implemented that, right? So just consider the same Lego strategy for sandboxes as well. So you want to implement something, or your organization wants to use Salesforce for a specific purpose. So in order to achieve that, you need something where you can build all that, test properly, give to the end user so that they also verify that. Then you move all the changes to production instance of Salesforce. Then you get what you want from Salesforce, right? So in order to achieve that, what are you using? Sandboxes. How you're using Legos here, Lego pieces to construct something. There you're using sandboxes to construct. Let us take a simple example. Simple example, like a small implementation, whatever the implementation that we took, right? So we will take that as a base example. Say I'm entering into Salesforce ecosystem, right? And my production instance, I have like very small implementation, like a Sales Cloud, and I have one admin and one developer. So my requirements are like, okay, Sales Cloud need to be implemented with the requirements are freezed and everything is good. Now I will create a developer edition of Sandbox, developer Sandbox, where my admin and my developer will build everything. They will test that unit testing. They will complete in that sandbox. And as I will get a full copy sandbox. I will push all my changes to the environment, staging or training purpose, whatever the way that I want to use my full copy sandbox. I will test everything there, and I will ask my stakeholders also to verify, okay, whether all the implementation followed the strategy, followed the best practices, and the way requirements were written. They will verify in this full copy sandbox. Then immediately they will push all the changes to production using change sets or whatever, because it's just one admin and one developer working for that smaller implementation, right? So once all changes are in production, so no software is like bug free, right? So we are living in a digital world, so small bugs will be there, or small enhancement request might come. So rather than again doing all the developments in my developer sandbox, means my admin or developer work on that, again push to full copy, again pushing to production, it's recommended like, okay, have a developer pro sandbox where depending upon the enhancement or depending upon bug, if admin need to be work on that, he will take that and he will work on this developer pro and he will push to production, and or developer will work on this developer pro sandbox and will push to production. So it's a small implementation. If you take a very what you call basic implementation, this is how it will be, right? So no complication, no complicated things like, okay, different varieties of sandbox introduction, or I want to use different tools to move from developer to another sandbox and all. It's a very small implementation, and uh, everyone knows what they're working on, and I want to push changes from one sandbox and it just happens like that. So this is a smaller implementation. Why can't you explain about the medium level of implementation? Go ahead.
Sure. Yeah. So The second strategy that we are going to call is the larger implementation. So let's see how that builds up. So you obviously start with your development. So the only difference between the smaller implementation and the larger implementation is basically, if you see here, there are multiple developer sandboxes. So what does that mean? And there are some grouped sandboxes as well. So let's start from where this whole animation started. So it is the developer sandboxes. That's where you started, right? So you do the build and configuration, your unit testing in your developer sandboxes. And it could be multiple teams. Let's say your project is having 2 teams, and you have one team using the developer sandboxes and the other team using developer pro sandboxes. Or it could be one team using developer sandboxes and there's one other standalone developer who's working on different module. But at the end of the day, it's going to go into your one application or maybe 2 applications. So they are going to work simultaneously. So the team one will not know what the other developer is doing. The other developer will not know what the team is doing. So they are going to push those changes into a particular sandbox, which is going to be we call it as integration sandbox, basically, because you push your developments from 2 different places to one sandbox, and then you test that whole thing, test the whole module as a application, and then see if each other's build is stable and not breaking each other's functionality. So that is like, and still it happens within your team itself. It doesn't go out of your team because you need to ensure your whole build is stable within your own teams. And then only we push it to your other sandbox, which is basically a partial copy. So we are going to go to the integration plus sandbox. We call it as integration plus stage because that is where your other teams, so we will see that in the hybrid strategy, but so that is where your existing applications would be there. So let's say if you're not having any other applications outside of this team, so you can basically push that to your partial copy, which will have all other applications. Let's say your sandbox is having 10 applications already and you're developing the 11th application, and your 11th application has 2 teams working on it. And this is how it will be. Your 2 team will first push into your internal sandbox, which is going to be a developer pro, because you don't need data for it. So you don't need the real-time data for it. So you can push it into your internal sandbox, test it together and see if your build is stable, and then you push it to your integration plus, which is going to be a partial copy, which has data plus other applications. As I told, for example, it is a 10 application, then you see whether your application, the 11th application, is stable along with the 10 applications. Because there could be some multiple scenarios where you might be using account contacts. These are like very common objects that you might be using along with the other applications. Your 10 applications might be sharing the account, the 10 applications might be sharing your contacts. So you need to make sure your 11th application is also doing well with the sharing rules and other permissions that you have given for the shared objects. So that is where your integration plus level of sandbox will help you. So which is going to be a partial copy. So you also have the real-time data, some of your real-time data. And once that is passed, and you move it to the staging. And also the partial copy would be the ideal place where you can do your UAT testing as well. So integration plus will also act as a UAT sandbox. So you can dedicate that as a UAT sandbox and then test it on the end user perspective as well. So once you move to the staging, as I told, full copy is going to be the ideal place for staging. So you stage it until your production data arrives. And then you're going to separate another, you can either clone sandbox from that full copy, or you can create a separate partial copy, depending on the quota of sandboxes that you have. So if you are running out of licenses for full copy, then probably you can go with partial copy. You can, or you can even sometimes use developer pro. So you get your another sandbox for training. So you have your real-time users or a closed group of real-time users for the training of your new application that you're developing, say the 11th application that you're developing. So until the production date arrives, you're not going to keep that whole development sitting in that staging. So it's going to, technically it's going to sit in that staging without any interferences. So staging basically means you don't interfere in that sandbox. You just keep it as it is. It's like, it will become like a source of truth. Apart from your version control, it will become like a practical source of truth that your application, anytime any of your VP or your stakeholders want to refer on your new application that is going to go production, they can actually go and visit the staging to see what is being built and if that is in line with your business requirements. And until it is sitting in the staging, you're not going to waste your time for your users. So you're going to give some sneak peek for your users. So ask your users to get trained in the application until it goes live. So from day one of the live production, they can get accustomed to the new application that you're developing. So that's why we create a separate sandbox for training, so it is not disturbed from staging, and then they get everything as it is a partial copy. They get everything on the application side and also on the data side. So they can get the partial copy of the data of that, and then they can do the real-time training in that sandbox. So once all these processes done, you're going to go for production on the particular date. And as we always tell, any software is it's not a bug-free in the practical world. So you're gonna get some production issues when you go live. It is expected, and a few depends on the criticality of the bugs. You may need to respond very quickly, like 2 hours or 3 hours. So we would ideally suggest keeping it as a separate sandbox for your prod support, which basically means that any bugs that is coming out of your production, put it in your prod support, and then you do the fixing there and then move to your production. If you have more cycle of time, you can actually connect this prod support to your lower sandboxes, so it goes through the whole cycle again. But in any practical scenario, I don't see that happening, because any bugs coming out of production is always considered critical most of the time, except for a few enhancements. So for the enhancements, probably you can go through the whole cycle. But if it is a critical, I would suggest have it as a developer pro sandbox, test it internally, test it carefully inside the same developer pro, and then push it to production. So
Guha, I have a question here. Here
sure.
you explained all the larger implementation or developer sandboxes, like when to use what and everything, right? So I don't see, like, now everyone are using, like, entering into Lightning Web Component and SFDX, ScratchOx and all that. Like, why I'm not seeing ScratchOx here in this implementation?
That's a great question. I was going to tell that. So if you see here in this whole layout, you don't see the ScratchOgs. So that's because it is a very ideal sandbox implementation strategies. So we didn't add the SFDX part earlier, but you can still connect your ScratchOgs. So the only best practice with these ScratchOgs, which I will recommend, is keep your ScratchOgs only for your development, or if you want to do a configuration, do just the configuration there, push it to your version control, and then bring it into your development sandboxes or any other lower level sandboxes that you already have, and then do the testing. So your internal team need not access your ScratchOgs, or even if they access your ScratchOgs, don't make it as an internal QA process in these ScratchOgs as such, because ScratchOgs are meant for like as the keyword says, SFDX, which basically means Salesforce Developer Experience. So ScratchOgs is basically for developers who's going to do command line programming, who's more into the command line programming, and they want to quickly spin up a environment safely to play around, or maybe to do a POC. So that is why the whole concept of ScratchOg was brought in. And now Salesforce is also encouraging us to do configurations in the ScratchOgs, which is totally fine, but never do your testing in the ScratchOgs. And it is also a Salesforce best practice not to do any of your QA part of it inside the ScratchOg. And to fit this whole ScratchOg in here, so if you look at the diagram here, let's assume there are 3 developers working on it, or 3 configurators working on it, and they have spin up their own ScratchOgs, and they can actually connect the ScratchOgs either through the version control, or if you do not have that version control block, you can actually connect the ScratchOgs directly to your sandboxes. All you need to do is you need to authorize the sandbox as your from your ScratchOg environment. So let's say you have spin up a ScratchOg, you've finished developing and everything, and now you need to from your VS Code instance, you just need to authorize your sandbox as the connecting org, and then you can start pushing the things into the sandbox. And the caveat there is you cannot pull down back into your scratch orgs. So for the scratch orgs, your full source will be from the hub, the development hub, whatever you have, environment hub you have created. So that's the only caveat there. And then you can actually, we would strongly recommend go through the version control, because that keeps you the whole source of truth. So whatever you develop, put it in your version control, resolve the conflicts, do the merging, and then bring it to your development environments where your data is actually present, and then do your testing there. So that's how the scratch org fits in the larger implementation. And we haven't talked about scratch orgs in the smaller implementation, because basically smaller implementation, as Adi told, it is a small time period. So you don't have to spin a scratch org for it, or typically any other smaller implementation ideally will not have a scratch org. Or if you choose to go with scratch org, you can basically connect these pieces into that smaller implementation as well. So now we have seen the smaller and the larger implementation. So let's see how this whole implementation model can fit into an enterprise level of implementation. So the only difference we saw in the implementation sizes is basically the enterprise level accommodates multiple engagements, multiple projects, multiple streamlines. So which basically means it's a fusion of smaller projects and larger projects together to make a enterprise level implementation. So let's say your smaller project is happening from January to June, or maybe January to March, and your larger implementation is happening from January till October or September, and probably you can club these together in parallel, and then you can, let's see how that's going to work out. So let's say this there's a separate project there in the smaller implementation. You have a couple of developer orgs, and you are doing your development there. And your larger implementation is, again, it's going to be a multiple team, and you have different developers, different teams working parallelly there. And as I told, in your larger implementation, you're going to go into your internal, that's an internal block of Sandbox that you have it for your own team testing, and also from the same project, but not from the different projects. So first you test your pieces from your same project, but different teams, into one Sandbox, which is the integration level of Sandbox, that is the Dev Pro. And then the smaller team, the smaller build coming from a completely a different application, different engagement. Let's say there will be a different SI partner working on that, and they can push all their changes directly to the partial copy. And your team changes once you're done with your larger implementation and you're internally tested within your team, you can push to your partial copy. And that's where it will make the integration plus makes more sense there, because it's coming from different, not only from different teams, it is coming from different engagements altogether. So your requirement, your business requirement, your business need, and your user experiences could be completely different from what they are developing. Let's assume a very common example of today. There are multiple projects which is getting transitioned to Lightning. So let's say the smaller build is basically a Lightning transition. So they are just converting their application to Lightning, and there is no big developments happening there. They're just converting everything to Lightning, and then they are pushing to Integration Plus. And your project is a complete vanilla application that you're creating, and then you are doing much more customization directly on the Lightning, and then you are pushing it to the Integration Plus Sandbox. And that's where you will be testing both applications, because the application which is converted from like classic to Lightning, which is already existing application, so they are making some changes to your existing application, and you are pushing a new application altogether, and that sits in your partial copy, and you have to test it in a cohesive manner whether this whole thing is going to be working in parallel with each other without breaking each other's functionality. And that's where your shared object resources will be taken in account. You'll be checking your security, your object security, your profile securities, and also your sharing rules that is not going to break your application in terms of data visibility perspective. And the scratch logs will be again connected to your VSE. So which means you will be, sorry, your version control, which means you'll be connecting your scratch logs, and then you'll be doing your development, pushing it to your version control and to your lower environments. So this is how the whole cycle works, and this is like a very typical enterprise level implementation, which doesn't mean that you have to be following just this rule as a ground rule. This is the maximum we could accommodate inside a slide. But if your organization is bigger enough to use much more levels of sandboxes, you should be probably, yeah, to go ahead and fit in more Lego pieces, like as Adi mentioned about the Lego analogy. So fit in more sandboxes into this cycle, into this representation. Try to build your strategy for whatever the level of implementation that you might be having. And if you see the declarative way of deployments, since this whole session is addressed for admins and also the release managers, we would also want to like iterate over the declarative types of deployments where you can either do through chain sets, or there are a few app exchange tools, not just limited to Copado and AutoRabbit. They are dominant on the market, but there are a few other tools which provide different other pricing options. You can explore that. And yeah, that's how the whole cycle for the enterprise level implementation works. So if you understand the smaller cycle and if you understand the larger cycle, probably you can mix and match together to form this enterprise level cycle. So with that being said, so Adi, let's get into some of the tips for our audience to better implement the strategies.
Yeah, that's what I'm about to say, because uh, like we mentioned, this is not the same strategy that everyone has to follow, because in our experience, that's why we segregated like a small, large, and enterprise. And these are the different implementations, different strategies that you can follow depending upon your company, depending upon the how your company follow the usage of sandboxes. You can change this, you can mix and match, you can change. Maybe you don't want to use integration as a developer pro, you want to use something else, or integration plus, you don't need that partial copy there, you can remove that. So only these strategies can be changed depending upon the way your organization work. But we come up with different strategy tips where these are the some of the tips that we come across with our experience, so which you can follow in your day-to-day implementations. So Goha, why can't you start with the first one?
Yeah. So to start with, yeah, as the starting point for everything in the practical world, we need a plan, right? So anything in your practical world, also in software world, we need a plan for whatever we are going to do. So when it comes to strategies, and it is even more sensitive that we have to have a plan in place. So you need to create. When I say plan, the plan here is not the actual strategy, the plan for the strategy itself. So you need to plan what kind of sandboxes you have, how many sandboxes you have, and what are the other resources available to you. So there could be multiple organizations involved in your implementation. So you need to plan how many SI partners are you going to work with, and you need to plan how many sandboxes you're getting for your organization. What is your addition of sandboxes? What is your license of sandboxes? So it's a cumulative of all the slides we have seen today. So you need to have the better understanding of what is available to you and what you can do with all those things. And out of that, you just create a checklist of items that, okay, I have all of these items, and I can extend my limits only up to this. And so because you have the strategy available, you may not be able to like use um, full copy sandboxes just like how you want to use as per the strategy. You may have to modify a little bit. Maybe the full copy is shared between multiple engagements, and you may not be freely able to use that. So that is where this whole planning will help you. So jot down all the list of items, what you have as a resources, and then plan accordingly.
Good. Also, in your organization, you have to identify a release manager. So the release manager is a person who is you can consider him as like a gatekeeper. So example, let us suppose in your implementation is a larger implementation, and everyone have all the abilities to deploy from one sandbox to another sandbox. Just imagine that situation. So developer can deploy whenever he wants, wherever he wants, from developer to developer pro, from sandbox to full copy. So wherever he wants, he can move changes to production. So do we want that type of strategy? No, because if you follow that type of implementation, if everyone has uh, all the abilities that they can able to play with these sandboxes, it's not right process that you are following. Every organization should have a release manager, whether it's a larger or small or enterprise implementation. The release manager will decide, he come up with a plan, he come up with a communication to all the stakeholders and all the people, and he come up with the number of days, like okay, which feature has to go from developer, or what is the time frame for development to complete, what is the time frame for QA to complete. All these dates and everything he will come up, and he will communicate accordingly. So the release manager is a key person to make your implementation successful, and moving all the changes from one sandbox to another sandbox, so that everyone who is working for that project or implementation, everyone has a clear idea of what's going on and when changes will be available in which sandbox. So release manager is a gatekeeper and a key person for your success of your project.
And when you said about the release manager, it also reminds me about the communication strategy here. So basically, when we look at the communication strategy, sometimes we confuse with the deployment strategies. That's why we have put up two separate pointers for them. So communication strategy is basically the way you communicate, and it's basically how, when, and where, and what. So basically, what you need to communicate. As a release manager, as you meant, as a gatekeeper, he or she has that responsibility to, communicate the release dates to a particular set of people. So who are those people? So that comes the who question. So those people would be either stakeholders, or those people could be a normal developer and admin on the ground level. So he or she has to know when this communication should go out. So he or she has to know when what kind of communication should go out. So you need not inform your VP of the organization for every sandbox refresh, right? So that's going to be a redundant communication, and that's not a important communication for a VP to know, like when a developer sandbox is going to be refreshed. But a development team or QA team needs to know when that is going to be refreshed, and way in advance, let's say 1 month ahead of the refresh cycle. So that is the level of strategy that the release manager should plan. And also, the person has to know what kind of information that has to be shared across. So he or she cannot be like sending out information for the username and passwords. So there has to be a certain way of communicating that username and password. If they are going to create a organization-wide generic password before they reset for the users themselves. So those are the strategies that the communication, as a release manager, the communication strategy should be designed. And why don't you talk about the difference from the communication strategy on the deployment side?
Sure. Communication is very important. Like Guha mentioned, you have to be very clear what you are communicating to your stakeholders or business users. So say VP of your organization does not need like, okay, when you're moving a small bug fix from your QA sandbox to integration pro, like, because he don't want to know all complete minute details. He just need to know the high level details of like, okay, when one stage of development will be completing and when it is moving and all. So if anything is like very critical, only those things need to be communicated without any fail. So the release manager knows what to communicate and when to communicate. So in his strategy, he will come up with a deployment strategy as well. Deployment strategy means how things need to be moved from one sandbox to another sandbox. So what all things need to be moved at what interval, or what on which date need to move from developer pro to developer sandbox or integration sandbox. And in this deployment strategy, he will include the Salesforce release dates as well. So why? Because Salesforce, we all know Salesforce like 3 releases every year, and other clouds like CPQ and marketing, they have their own release cycles. But in his deployment strategy, he will include these dates as well, and accordingly he will plan. Why? Because so what are the new features or enhancements Salesforce is releasing, those should not contradict or cause some other issue for your what are the customization that you are going to move changes to production, right? So he will be considering all those releases. He will be considering what all changes Salesforce is coming up, and is there any impact. Oh, if there is an impact, how to handle that. All these things he will include in his deployment strategy. Then accordingly he will communicate to whoever is the concerned team need to work on that. If it is a development team, need to update their JavaScript libraries, or they need to update their code, which is going to contradict with Salesforce new releases. You will communicate, and accordingly the concerned team will work. Then changes will be moved from that sandbox to the necessary sandbox, so that your deployment will be smooth, clear, without any fire alarms in your production instance. So he is a, like I mentioned in the starting itself, like release manager is a key person who will take care of complete cycle of your implementation. So he or she, whoever is the person is taking care of this. So the release manager knows complete details of your deployments and releases.
And when you talked about the deployment strategy, it also reminds me about that point of sandbox templates. And glad you talked about it earlier, because that's a very critical part in one of your recommendations, because you can cut down a lot of time through the sandbox templates. Like Aditya mentioned, you can actually select your objects, and along with the objects, your data also goes along in the template. So that's going to cut down a lot of time when you try to refresh a sandbox, refresh a full copy, or refresh a partial copy, or maybe you are creating a full copy or partial copy for the first time. You can actually take leverage of these type of sandbox templates, and once you create a template, it's going to be available always, and you can like keep reusing it every time, and you can even update those sandbox templates. So you cut down the time on the data loading, and we have seen a lot of projects that's taking a lot of time for the data load, and also especially in terms of connecting those related objects. That takes a lot of manual effort in when you do that data load. So Aditya, why don't you talk about that sandbox only user, what it actually means?
Sure. Sandbox only user, when you're creating users or creating these sandboxes, identify the persons who require only access to sandboxes. So example, uh, a person who has to sanity check what all things, let's say product manager. So yes, he has to have access to production, but not a dedicated access where you will be using a full Salesforce license, right? So identify the users who should not need a production access. Identify user who should not see critical and sensitive information on your sandboxes. Then accordingly give them the necessary access. So instead of wasting your full license of your Salesforce instance, identify the people and give only sandbox access. Like even the sandbox also, if you want to give only a specific sandbox, you can give as it is sandbox. It won't cost anything. You can just give those users all sandbox access, so that they have access to Salesforce at different levels of your implementation, and accordingly they will come, they will did their part, and they'll just go like that, rather than giving them the production access and showing them the sensitive information of production data. So you have to identify, means release manager, definitely he is going to identify uh, how many such people are there in your implementation, and accordingly he will plan the access and he will give them the necessary access. So release manager is a key person. So like I just mentioned a flavor of like a sensitive information. Why can't you cover data obfuscation, which is
Yep.
one of the key thing that you have to consider.
Yeah, and also it also connects to your point on that sandbox only user, because as you mentioned, the sensitive information, which basically in US it is the SSN number, and since people in this presentation are joining from different locations, so you can assume your sensitive information based on the geographical location where you are. So for us, SSN, which is basically the social security number of any person, is like the one and only identification number, and you may not want to lose that identity to someone else, right? So let's assume your developer is getting access to one of those SSN numbers. So it could terribly go wrong, not only on the release management perspective, but also it could completely damage your company's identity as a SI partner, and also on the client side, it also depreciates the whole trust factor on the client as a company. So we got to be very careful about masking your data. And speaking about data masking, so we are coming back to the initial point of the new sandbox release that is being the new sandbox that has been unveiled in the Dreamforce. So it has a feature of automatic data masking. So we will wait for more information on that, but just keep it in mind that there is a new sandbox coming out probably soon, and that's going to have a lot of features like masking those sensitive information. So apart from that, social security, your email ID, your phone numbers, so all this information, imagine if it gets to the hands of a developer, if it is getting to the hand of an admin, you may not want to have your personal information sent out. I mean, like not sent out, like it is being exposed to your team of developers or testers who's working on the application from behind the scenes, right? So you have to be very careful in masking those data when you refresh the sandboxes. So not only refresh, and also while creating the sandboxes, make sure all these data are wiped out, or if you need it for testing, scramble them. There are a few app exchange tools for that as well. Like you can actually scramble those data that is present in any sandboxes. So do explore those options as well. So looking at the whole list of pointers we have listed over here, I think I would say this is like the minimum requirement for any strategy that you're going to build, but I wouldn't limit myself to this particular list. So keep exploring based on your level of implementations, your the extensive levels that you might be strategizing your sandboxes. You might also discover more best practices for your organization. And that could be some standard best practices in terms of data security and your network security. So have those as well on the consideration when you design those sandbox strategies. So yeah, so that's all we would advise. More than these strategies tips, keep your mind open. And also in terms of strategizing sandboxes, you might be seeing just 3 strategies for today, but as I told, we are just showing you how you can build the Lego blocks, and that doesn't mean that that those Lego blocks can be built in that one particular way. So we just showed you how you can stack up those Lego blocks to build a building. Now you can go ahead and start building your car, or you want to build something else from the Lego blocks. You can do that. Similar way with these sandboxes as well. Consider each sandbox like a Lego pieces, and then you can just keep connecting based on your organization need, your organization structure. Yeah, there are multiple, like there are hundreds of factors that will influence your strategy. So keep that in mind, and uh, start whiteboarding, or maybe you want to do it virtually on your computer, whatever is comfortable for you. So with that as a finishing touch, we would say that concludes our presentation today. So if you have any questions, we are now open for questions. And also, before going to the
There are
question, so we
references.
have this.
Yeah, that's what I'm about to say.
Possible
There are references. How can we miss the references slide? So, like we mentioned, these are the trailhead modules that you can go through. Very useful. And whatever that we covered today, everything is covered in these trailhead modules, and also the reference document that we added here. If you want to use like change set deployments, like I mentioned, smaller implementation, I don't want any tool or external application that I don't want to use because my organization is a small organization. So if you are using a change set deployment, yeah, complete reference for change set deployment. And Sandboxes enhancement, like this documentation, like these two are like related to Salesforce documentation itself, and also trailhead modules covering all whatever that we talked today. So in depth, whatever that we talked and explained today is you can find in these trailhead modules. Like Goha mentioned, it's not the only place or only references that you can look into. There are a number of references documents are there and the trailhead modules, but just keep exploring, keep your mind open, and just depending upon your company usage, depending upon your organizational structure, you can change these strategies, and according to your usage you can use these strategies. So with our experience, we come up with these type of strategies that everyone generally follows in the Salesforce ecosystem. So depending upon your research, you can change your strategy, or you can come up with a new strategy and you can share with us, so that in our further conferences, if we present this, we will implement that as well, so that it will be useful for all the users. So with that, we want to conclude the presentation. And one good thing with this presentation I found is, as Salesforce is only 40-minute duration, we have to present and we have to be very quick. And here we have time flexibility, so we can speak with more examples, and we explain each slide with more in detail. I think this is nice. 40 minutes is like very, very fast paced. We went, me and Goha knows that. But this is very nice. Thanks to Amit and team.
Yeah,
so
I was actually
now
going to say that. Thank you, Amit, for giving this opportunity, because we were able to talk a lot about what we had,
Correct.
what we couldn't talk in the Dreamforce because we had a time limit.
Correct. So with that, we want to open the Q&A session. If anyone has any questions, you can ask. Feel free to ask the questions here, or you can post your questions on the chat window.
And I see a few questions being posted directly to me. If you can post it in the group chat, people also can see the question so they can relate what I'm answering to.
Otherwise, Goa, you can directly read that question and answer them, or I just allow everyone to unmute themselves and they can ask the question directly as well.
Duha, funny here, probably I can repeat the question.
Sure, funny. Yeah, go ahead.
So the question was about the DX and the fitting of these scratch arcs. And I got the very detailed information from your slide, but I still have one question. Can we replace the sandboxes completely with the scratch arcs?
No, we would definitely not recommend that. And it is not a very good practice from Salesforce standpoint as well. And so we had this interesting question coming up in Dreamforce as well. So one of the person asked if Salesforce Scratch Arc is going to replace all the sandboxes, and would there be like different configurations of Scratch Arcs that would be coming out that everyone can use it, and the sandboxes are going away for good? It is definitely not. If it is the case, they wouldn't be spending a lot of investment in releasing a new type of sandbox for Lightning. So, which is obviously the answer is use your Scratch Arc only for your development purpose. The reason they have unveiled the concept of Scratch Arc was basically initially they started with the developer experience. Basically, developers who felt little I wouldn't say uncomfortable, they felt little extensive to log in into a sandbox and waiting for the sandbox creation to happen. If you have a very big organization, your sandbox could take up more than a day of time to get created. So to cut down those efforts on the wait time and fasten up your development, that is where the concept of Scratch Arc was brought into place. And that speeded up the development process. So which basically means you have either for configuration or development on the Scratch Arc and push all the changes to a sandbox, because sandbox, as we gave as a definition, Sandbox is basically the safe and secure environment with all the features that is enabled in production. So whatever the features, like I'm not talking about the data, I'm not talking about the size of the sandbox. I'm talking about the features of the sandboxes. So whatever you see in production instance, all the features are enabled in your sandbox. So which is basically kind of a replica of your production instance, except for the size. And that is where you want to actually test your application, right? So Scratch.org still has certain limitations, still has limits on what features are enabled. Still, though it looks like completely like a sandbox, the best practice is not to do any testing in the Scratch.org, so which will limit your Scratch.org usage just for the development and configuration.
And top of it, I just want to add one more point. Basically, Scratch.org concept is come up for the feature-based development. You heard about multiple terms like feature-based development, story-based development. So this is something kind of feature-based development. So meaning of it, like build your own feature, complete it within a time period of expiration, because Sandbox don't have expiration date, but Scratch.org have 30 days. That is maximum, I guess. I hope I'm on the right number. And after that, concept say once you down everything, put all your features into the version controlling system, so that you develop. We want to bound the developer. Okay, this feature you need to complete within the 4 sprint or the 4 week or something like that. So that is why the Scratch.org concept coming. But there might be possibility you have a big implementation that cannot be completed in that particular scenario. Sandbox come into the picture, so that you will put your feature into that particular sandbox, because that will be not expire, but your Scratch.org will be expire after 30 days. I hope Goa number is right? 30 days or 31 something.
30 days. 30 days is the max. 30 days is the max. That's right.
30 days max.
Correct. I want to add one more point to that, and I want to conclude this. Scratch.orgs are, even though, like you mentioned, Amit, larger implementation or enterprise implementation, whatever it is, everything will be planned and everything will be split as like number of sprints, and okay, this feature will be completed on so and so week and all, right? So according to that, you will have your Scratch.org and your development will be completed, and once it is completed, merge to your version control. From there, whatever the sandbox is has to move, just move that and test it, right? And also, I'm just thinking, Salesforce come up with this Scratch.orgs because all developers like command line interface, right? Okay, things need to be fast, like our fingers move on the keyboard very fast rather than the mouse, right? So if SFDX commands and everything is there, and also it is faster, right? From moving deployment, once you complete your development, just saving on your Salesforce org and moving from one executing your commands and everything, command line interface is faster for developers for their implementation. So I think that is also one of the reasons they come up with this command line interface and SFDX command, so to make developer development faster. So
exactly. So the Scratch.org creation is made very faster, and from the command line, it just creates in like few minutes.
Correct.
Correct. For hours.
Thank you for the detailed information on that.
Yeah. I got one more question. Can a can a sandbox full copy be created from another sandbox? Good question. Mostly whatever that we saw is like full copy sandbox, like one full copy sandbox will be there. Even if your organization bought another full copy sandbox also, it's always recommended to refresh a full copy sandbox from production, because it's your production data, right? Complete production information. So example, if you want to refresh your full copy sandbox with a developer pro, doesn't make any sense, right? Because you are using your full copy like costless sandbox for your specific need, right? It's a staging environment that you want to use that full copy sandbox, right? It's always recommended to use your full copy sandbox as staging or final before moving all changes to production. Use that copy sandbox with all the production changes rather than something else. But using a full copy sandbox, yes, you can create a developer pro or a copy of the small portion of full copy sandbox developer pro or developer or partial copy like that. But full copy sandbox, you should be careful usage.
And so there is one other question. Can you please explain a bit more about sandbox refresh limits?
Before that, there is one more question, Guha. shouldn't the VCS be connected to all environments? Version
yeah.
control.
Yeah, I kind of missed that. So yeah, that's a great question. Shouldn't the version control be connected to all the environments? So it depends. It's a very scenario case by case basis. So for our strategy here to keep it simple, we have connected to directly to the lower environments, and we have kept it that way for a reason where the Scratch org is being also involved in this implementation. And if you see, the Scratch org is being the developments from the Scratch org is being pushed to the version control, and from version control you go to the development environments. But if you do not have that, you can actually connect to other environments as well, as long as you are on the right branch. Let's say you are doing a release and you have a release branch dedicated in the version control, and you're only going to push that release branch to the upper sandboxes. It is totally okay to connect those version control to different sandboxes as well. But at the same time, we would not recommend connecting the version control to the staging. As I always tell, staging has to be coming from your lower sandboxes. Or if you're going to connect your version control, make sure that you're moving the complete copy of your production. So whatever the branch you have it, either you have it in a branch or you have it in your master, whatever the place you're having the complete build, push that build into the staging and not from your release branches. So your staging should be like the final copy. There should not be any upgrade after the staging place. So that's why we would recommend connecting to the lower sandboxes if that is comfortable. If you think that is too much of effort to push from sandbox to sandbox, you can always connect to the version control as well. And yeah, moving on to the next question here. I hope I didn't miss any questions in the top. Let me just scroll through. Yeah, so the next question is, can you explain a bit on the sandbox refresh limit? So let me go back to that slide. Probably that's in the initial slides. So as we have this presentation specifically on the strategy, so we kind of give a refreshing talk on these types of sandboxes. We didn't deep dive into it. So if you want a snapshot, this is the snapshot of refresh intervals for each of the sandboxes. For developer pro, it's 1 day refresh time, which means that you can refresh every other day. Like if I refresh it today morning 10 o'clock, I can do a refresh after 24 hours. So with the partial copy, you can do 5 days interval, and with full copy, you can do 39 days, which is almost like a month of duration. So these are the refresh times, and there's nothing much to deep dive in the refresh cycles. It's like a predefined refresh cycle. You cannot alter this. You cannot like yeah, you cannot basically alter these cycles. It is the given hard restriction on these sandboxes. So if you have refreshed it, you got to wait for 5 days for the partial copy. If you have refreshed it today, you have to wait for 29 days for the full copy sandbox. That's how the whole refresh cycle works for these sandboxes.
I think the option itself will be disabled for those many days. That's what I observed. So once you refresh that, after several, whatever the time frame is there, after that only the refresh link will be enabled for that sandbox. It's a hard limit of Salesforce.
Okay, so there's one very long question. So let me first read it up.
Yeah, the question I can explain. So from Darshan, so he has like different instance of Salesforce, different clients, but same product with the different configurations. So they are investing a lot of time for configuration changes, different client, but our product is same. So could you suggest, as per your experience, which is best way to go about? Currently I'm using GearSet. There's a lot of time even invested in leveling up two different org and their dependent files, and there is Git as version control system.
So I may have, I couldn't quickly come up with an answer for this, but I may have a suggestion here. Since you are already using GearSet, if you are going to continue whatever the license for GearSet, continue that. I would say there are a few other app exchange tools as I show up in this slide, Copado, AutoRabbit. So that gives you also more flexibility on like creating like how we create sandbox templates. There are also multiple tools that provide deployment templates as well. So basically, you can create a template of items that you would constantly keep pushing into sandboxes. When I say items, it's all the build configurations that you have already done, and you don't have to click selecting of all these in the change sets every time you do. So there
I
are
could not able to, I could not able to recollect what I did, but when I tried GearSet, because we never bought GearSet for our org. When I tried GearSet, I think there are different versions that you can create for your configuration changes and all. Or in my experience, I used sandbox templates. Depending upon the usage, I used the necessary template and we deployed. Or initial stages of my development and all, we used anti-deployment. We used to have so different configurations files we used, and depending upon the usage, we used to run that file, that build file. So that is easy. I know it's a old methodology that we followed, but still, if that makes your that is saving your time a lot, there is nothing wrong in going back and using the hand scripts. So that's one of the things that I can recommend.
Okay, thank you Aditya and thank you Guha for your time over the weekend. And I will request all other people, if they still have any question, feel free to post your question on ApexR website, and we will try to post the recording and PPT of this session on our on our ApexR page. And if you have any question, feel free to post over there. We will try to answer them. And thank you everyone for the joining, and thank you Guha and Aditya for the great information.
Thank you everyone for